funded by Commemoration Naman with the television licence fee.
The Great War, or World War I, which lasted from 1914 to 1918, was one of the biggest conflicts in Irish history. More Irish men and women served in it than in all the wars before or since. When the conflict ended, it's estimated that somewhere in the region of 200 to 300,000 Irish people had partaken in it, with well over 45,000 of them being killed. For those who survived the war and returned home, many suffered chronic shell shock, which is nowadays known as post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD for short. Now, to find out more, I recently visited a commemoration service at the National War Memorial Gardens, situated at Island Bridge in Dublin, and got talking with Paul Stevenson, chairperson of the Royal British Legion, Republic of Ireland District.
Shellshock. That's what was classified. Now it's PTSD, the modern
terminology.
There was no treatment for it, and these guys just suffered alone. They were kind of ostracised. I remember as a child in my village road in County Offaly, we had about 4 or 5 World War I veterans lived in the village, and 1 or 2 of them had shell-shocked, and we used to be afraid of them because they didn't conform to the normal standard of living in life, you know. And so we used to be, they were all harmless really, but they just
couldn't normalise, couldn't integrate back into the so-called normal scheme of things.
At that time, of course, a lot of them were ostracised because they'd fought in the British Army in World War I, and they came back to a very different Ireland than they left. With the troubles here in 1916,
the execution of the 1916 Easter Rising leaders sparked outrage against British rule in Ireland and radically turned Irish public opinion in favour of separation from the British Empire. Now, this ultimately led to the Irish War of Independence, which began in 1919, shortly after World War I finished. Dr. Brian Hughes of the Department of History at Mary Immaculate College, Limerick.
Where you have these traumatised men returning home and trying to integrate back into society. In Ireland, what's different is the politics have changed completely. So these are not the veterans who are coming home to be celebrated for winning the war, as they might have been in Britain. In Ireland, they're coming back having fought on the wrong side, as it were. So the challenges that were there more generally in terms of integration into society or reintegration after the war were there in Ireland, but the political situation was very different in Ireland than it was in Britain, for example. And so that added additional challenges for these Irishmen who'd worn British uniform to reintegrate into society.
Nowadays, medical experts fully recognise post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, as a legitimate and serious mental health condition, triggered by experiencing or witnessing terrifying, life-threatening or violent events. However, during the 1914-18 war, or First World War, attitudes were very different. Bray local historian Brian White.
PTSD wasn't a medically diagnosed symptom back in the First World War. He's coming home from the war, it's war-affected injuries, and that's it. And he didn't talk about them, and they didn't give him any support or medical services.
PTSD as we know it now, shell shock as it was termed that time, wasn't really understood at the time.
County Kildare military historian James Durney.
And a lot of people had to live with that for the rest of their lives, lived in horror for the rest of their lives, trauma that very few people understood. And this is the type of men that are returning to a normal Ireland, and they're abnormal as such. And it's hard, and people are not that sympathetic, maybe for a year or two, but a lot of these men live on into the 1960s and the 1970s and have to live with this for the rest of their lives, and it's not easy.
So much so that some World War I veterans such as Private Sparrow from County Kilkenny ended up living out the remainder of their lives in mental asylums. Larry Scallon, Irish Defence Forces Commandant retired and also a military historian.
Private Sparrow, and he was from Freshford, County Kilkenny. And he came back in Kilkenny here in 1918, got off the train. He was brought to St. Canice's Asylum, as it's called, and he stayed there until he died in 1968. He never left the asylum.
Wow, 50 years in the asylum. Oh my God.
And then he was buried just in an ordinary grave, and the people that he was forgotten, even his family kind of forgot that he had been, you know, his immediate family had all passed away and there was nobody to remember him when he was buried. So that his life ended in 1918 in Flanders. Whatever shell that landed close to him that managed to switch off a certain part of his brain to being able to deal with that level of, you know, being afraid, horror of what's going to happen to me, when that wasn't able to switch off when he came home. And so his last coherent thought was in Flanders somewhere in 1917 or 1918, because when he came home he was a non-functioning human being who couldn't be part of society. So he was put into the asylum and he stayed there for 50 years.
We know from here in Kilkenny that, you know, multiple numbers of men ended up in, say, what is now St. Canice's, or was St. Canice's Hospital. We know from our own research with the Monstar, you know, plenty of them ended up in a mental institute in Wexford, in Clonmel. It was widespread, and I suppose it couldn't have been any other way. Like, we know stories, anecdotal stories of men that would have been called, I suppose, that they were wandering the roads of Ireland after the war, you know, going from farmer to farmer over the course of the summer. Couldn't live in a house, couldn't, you know, were living in sheds, working with farmer labourers. Like, there's multiples of those stories that we now know were veterans of World War I.
Mary Ann Marr of the 18th Regiment of Foot Royal Irish Regiment and South Irish Horse Association. It's estimated that for every soldier who died in the 1914-18 war, roughly 3 others were seriously wounded. Now, needless to say, every town and parish in Ireland had a share of wounded veterans. William Henry, Galway historian and also author of the book Galway and the Great War.
I remember meeting a man from Ballinasloe, and he said he remembered the lazy wall in Ballinasloe. I didn't know there was one down there, but he said he remembered when he was a child. He remembered the mints there. One of them might be missing an eye, another lad might be missing a leg, another lad missing an arm. So nobody talks about the wounded that came back.
Returning soldiers, blinded, maimed, missing limbs, you know, coming back, coughing up their lungs from the gas and that.
James Durney. Here's Jackie Green of Castledermot Local History Group in County Kildare.
Lungs were damaged by gas, many scars gained, but worse again, who knows how many minds were lost or deranged, and there were a lot.
It wasn't just the casualties on the Western Front, and I don't mean just either. I mean, it was the casualties that came home, the walking casualties, you know.
Lots of them came home damaged psychologically, so they weren't really able to reintegrate themselves into Irish society. They were sort of the lost generation.
You've injured, wounded, shell-shocked men returning to Ireland.
There is a very large proportion of men that are marked down as shell shock, neurasthenia, in some cases nerves.
They had these awful experiences, they come back, they don't talk about them, we have nothing set up in any way to deal with it.
PTSD and so on, to think what these poor men went through and the lack of sympathy and understanding.
The men that had to come back, it just had to have been a living nightmare for the vast majority of them.
And before we delve further into the hidden stories of those Irish men and women who survived the 1914-18 war, in particular those suffering chronic physical and psychological injuries, first we need to briefly investigate why countless Irish people went to war in the first place. Historian Dr. Brian Hughes.
There were a whole range of factors that motivated men to join the British Army after the outbreak of war in August 1914. There were some who heeded John Redmond's call to go wherever the firing line extends. They went and fought because they felt they were fighting for nationalist Ireland and the promise of home rule, that it was their duty to go and secure home rule for Ireland. Some went to similarly defend what's described as Little Catholic Belgium, which had been invaded by the Germans. So there's some political motivation. For Ulster Unionists, the obvious motivation there again is to defend king and country.
And while some who went to war were politically motivated, for others it was primarily about the money. Military historian James Taylor.
There was all sorts of reasons to join. I'd imagine for most of them the pay was better and your wife got an allowance. And if you were killed, your family got a pension, which if you just died in an industrial accident, they weren't going to get. So it was incentives, financial incentives as well.
The financial reasons was the main reasons that were out there. James Connolly was right when he said, conscription by starvation.
William Henry. World War I was a conflict of unprecedented horror, characterised by a lethal combination of outdated 19th century tactics and 20th century industrial technology. Professor Terence Dooley of the Department of History at Maynooth University.
Nobody was anticipating the type of warfare that they were going to find themselves in when they headed off to the Western Front in 1914. Now, and I've read enough of the memoirs, diaries and so on of officers in the army to realise that when they set out in the first place, initially the type of warfare that they would have been conditioned for and that they were used to, this is what they were expecting. And then within weeks they're starting to talk about the horrors of the trenches. It's coming into winter, of course, at this stage. They're talking about the flooded trenches, rats everywhere, decaying bodies everywhere. They're going over the top and they're watching people being killed in massive numbers all around them. They're ending up in pools of water with decapitated bodies around them, all types of horrors that nobody anticipated or expected. So, the horror of the war comes home to them very, very quickly, within a matter of weeks. And of course, they had to endure that then for years.
The artillery is by far and away the worst part of every letter you read back that you're allowed that wasn't censored, and all the reports coming back was it was the artillery. So you're constantly living on your nerves. Is there going to be a stray shell? Something else going to happen?
County Wicklow military historian John Goodman. Here's James Durney.
This World War, this massacre, and it takes its toll on men physically and mentally. And it's where all these new terms, shell-shock, post-traumatic stress and all come from because of the intensity of the war itself.
Post-traumatic stress disorder from the effect of the shelling and of the sheer terror. Can you imagine for a soldier, the whistle is blown at 6 a.m. and over the top you go and you had to hope you came back.
Sabina Purcell, whose grandfather fought in World War I. Here's New Ross historian Pádraig Ryan.
There's no other word to describe it other than a killing zone. And then we had the fearful aspect that if you didn't go over the top, you were liable to be shot or at least court-martialed and then shot. Shot at dawn, as they used to say. But either way, you were a loser. You had no chance. God help those men of all nationalities. God help them all and their families.
Very often you would have heard of soldiers being shot for cowardice. It was almost certainly not cowardice. It was that they'd got shell shock and they just weren't capable of standing up and going to fight again. Yeah, and yet they were shot for it.
Brian Crawford, Secretary of the Royal British Legion in the Republic of Ireland. Around 26 Irish soldiers were executed by the army in World War I for military offences like desertion or cowardice. Even though, as just touched on, It's nowadays generally acknowledged that they were most likely suffering from chronic shell shock or PTSD. When the war eventually ended in November 1918, its toxic PTSD legacy lived on among countless soldiers returning home. Now, I had this question to ask Brian Crawford. How prevalent was shell shock with those First World War veterans coming back to a changed Ireland?
Absolutely horrendous. I mean, the war then was an artillery war. Most of the casualties were from artillery shells, and if you have an explosion going off a couple of feet away from you, it's not going to do you any good.
Post-traumatic stress disorder. I believe every one of them came back with it. There's no point in saying they didn't. Every soldier must have been affected badly in some form or another.
County Kildare military historian Clement Roach. Here's Larry Scallon.
Lots of them came home damaged psychologically. If you came back with a physical disability, you could be helped. We could make a prosthesis for you of sorts. You could have crutches for your leg. But if you came back with post-traumatic stress disorder, what we call it now, back then it was called shell shock, there was no answer. There was two answers, but there was no real answer. The answer was to lock you up in a mental institution, an asylum, or you would lose yourself into the bottle of whiskey. Alcohol was the only answer. And lots of these guys became, unfortunately, desperate alcoholics when they came home. They couldn't function. Lots of them couldn't sleep on their roofs because unless they saw the stars outside, they had too many incidents where they lost friends in collapsed trenches due to shells, bombing, landing close by, and they were smothered to death before they could, clear them out. Lots of them, they slept under the stars. They went to the local pub. They drank themselves into forgetfulness.
Oblivion and forgetfulness for very obvious reasons.
Yeah, for very obvious reasons.
And as has been mentioned several times already in this documentary, those soldiers who survived the war and got back home to Ireland had to contend with a radically changed country. Jackie Green.
The soldiers returning to a changed Ireland found there was room for only one set of heroes, and it sure wasn't them.
It was like the guys coming back from Vietnam. Nobody wanted to know. They were in the wrong war, fighting for the wrong cause.
James Taylor. Irish veterans returning from the 1914-18 war received a deeply divided and complex reception, ranging from muted informal welcomes to active hostility. For example, in July 1919 a significant street fight occurred in Athy, County Kildare, between World War I veterans and supporters of Sinn Féin, the then dominant Irish Republican Party. Clement Roach.
The local Sinn Féiners and the men who came home were fighting each other up and down the streets in the town. So you can see that as a case in being of what happened when they came home.
Upon their return home, the vast majority of World War I veterans did their best to return to ordinary civilian life and avoid trouble. James Durney.
When they return, they kind of keep their heads down. Most of the men do try and get on, get their lives back in order and that, because some of them are in not great condition. They've had a lot of mental and physical trauma for the last couple of years, and then to try and get their way back into society, get a job, rear their family, make contact with the wives and children that haven't seen for years and that, and are different people when they return. So there's all that, and in the middle of this is the War of Independence.
And we'll hear more very shortly about the challenges for veterans in getting work. But staying for the moment with the topic of the Irish War of Independence, a not insignificant number of veterans helped to train and lead the IRA in that freedom struggle against the British, which raged from 1919 to 1921. Dublin City Council historian in residence, Dr. Cormac Moore.
It's more common than often meets the eye, and often suggested by some commentators. There were a lot of ex-soldiers that joined the IRA and are recognised as significant figures in the fight for independence, including Tom Barry and Emmet Dalton.
The IRA were trained by the British Army in effect, because the lads that all came back were mostly former British soldiers.
Larry Scallon.
And they didn't have to be high-level rank. Tom Barry was a Lance Bombardier. He wasn't an officer in the British Army, but he got enough of the understanding of the capabilities of a 303 to know how to deploy those 303s down in Kilmichael. And that's very obvious if you've walked the ground down there, that they knew how to set up an ambush. Whether they had ever done one before, he just was able to read the ground, he was able to deploy soldiers, his flying column, and they were able to ultimately annihilate a very superiorly armed auxiliary patrol.
I know of a lot of men that were actually former Irishmen, that some of them were in the British Army.
William Henry.
And in fact, when you look at some of the training that was done by former British soldiers, you know, like in Castlegar there now, I know that some of them were trained by ex-British soldiers who were like Irishmen, to be honest, you know, not British soldiers, you know, the men that had fought in the war, that there were expertise in arms now at this stage.
It's estimated that during the Irish Civil War from 1922 to 1923, in and around half of the rank and file of the National Army of the new Irish Free State was formed from World War I veterans. However, as touched on earlier, most veterans were determined to leave their soldiering behind them and move on with their lives. So what kind of challenges did they face in getting work? Historian Dr. Brian Hughes of Mary Immaculate College, Limerick.
Finding work, you know, there are cases of discrimination. Now again, there's no universal experience of the return to Ireland after the First World War, and veterans have all sorts of experiences which are often quite individual, but certainly there are some cases of discrimination, whether that's kind of subtle or more obvious in terms of employment. You might say perhaps naturally enough, if there are vacancies going, there's a preference to employ ex-National Army men in particular. Even ex-anti-treaty IRA found, you know, there are problems finding work in Ireland. So discrimination was not just confined to ex-British servicemen, but it was potentially there.
Yet despite such potential discrimination, some World War I veterans were fortunate enough to have protective employment to return to.
My name is Sabina Purcell, and I had a grandfather, Sergeant James Purcell, who served in World War I with the South Irish Horse. He saw his first theatre of action in August of 1914, and he came home in March 1918 to marry my grandmother, and he went straight back and came through the war. He was very lucky because he had his job when he came home. It was what's known as protective employment, and he was with the post office. He told my father to the day he came home, to the day he died, he would not be discussing the war because he did not want to inflict the horrors of it on the next generation. But my dad did tell me that he had horrific nightmares, screaming, shouting, because of the impact of the war, because people forget it wasn't just physical impact, but it was a mental impact as well.
Most of the time veterans probably just eased back into their own jobs, as the case would be, because most of them probably left on the grounds. Anyone that volunteered after the initial war probably were guaranteed their jobs, like a lot of places did.
Military historian Clement Roach from Athy in County Kildare.
So they were either come back to Minch Nortons as it was, or to the Canal, or Hammond's Mills, if the case may be. A lot of them probably just eased back, came home, eased back into life. They probably had an extra few quid after being discharged, I suppose, because the backup of wages would eventually catch up on you if you're in there.
And staying with the topic of protective employment for veterans, Sabina Purcell also had this to say.
These men, they were lucky. Some of them worked in St. James's Gate, the Bank of Ireland. Some of them worked in mills around. My grandfather was at the post office, so they had their protected jobs. But somebody told me a very nice story of a veteran who ran the cinema in Castlebar, and it was run ship-shape. There was no hanky-panky in the back seats when he was on duty.
They're good army discipline
Yes,
there, lads. Or behave yourselves
yes.
now, or it's going to be a court-martialling.
It's a good point, because they were very disciplined, and that's why St. James's Gate liked them, that they were able to cope with routine work on the shop floor and all of that. And in fairness to St. James's Gate, they employed hundreds. St. James's Gate alone had over 600 staff members serve in World War I.
Not only did James's Gator Guinness have protected employment for World War I veterans, but it also proactively filled any new job vacancies with them. Brian White.
Some got employment in very pro-British companies here in Ireland, the likes of Guinnesses, etc. And here you have the likes of Gay Byrne's father, who was working on the Earl of Meath's estate. The Earl of Meath, anybody who came home of good service record got an extra £5. But then, because of the agricultural depression, they hadn't got enough need for the manpower, so some of them then went into the companies such as Guinness's, and he went into Guinness's. And Gay Byrne has told the thing about his father, about how he would wake up at night in cold sweats and all the rest from the war.
In the main, the vast majority of them just actually wanted to put their heads down, get a job, maybe as a farm labourer. Some of them set up little businesses for themselves out of their pensions, or some of them got a grant, set up little delivery services, little things like that. Like, it's actually amazing.
Marianne Marr. And although a significant number of World War I veterans succeeded in either their entrepreneurial endeavours or in finding a job, nevertheless many others were not so lucky. In particular, those seriously wounded or physically maimed. Historian William Whelan of Waterford County Museum, situated in Dungarvan.
We all know about the war dead, but we don't hear about the war wounded. My granduncle lost a leg in the Royal Field Artillery in 1918, and he, as far as we know, wasn't exceptionally well educated. He had to come back on a very small pension, and he had to try and source work. And in the form that he filled out looking for work, he said he was most anxious to secure any work that would be suitable for a man with one leg. Now, on one level, you'd kind of half laugh when you read that sentence. On another level, when you viewed the type of work that was available to people at that time, I mean, you had no computers, you had very little in the way of clerical work. They probably didn't have the education to do it anyway. An awful lot of these guys that came back, that were wounded and injured and hurt, were not really able to enter back into society properly. My own granduncle died unmarried in the mid-1930s as a consequence of the amputation of his leg. There was an infection kind of set in. It was quite common, I think, for people who had amputations to die approximately 10 to 15 years after the amputation. It was a slow disease of the bone. And of course, the very fact that he was unmarried, he probably couldn't work, couldn't afford to have a family. There was all these sort of side effects that would have occurred that people are not aware of. So when you're looking at the role of the Great War dead, there's no role for the Great War wounded.
They couldn't get jobs, a lot of them. And of course there was no mobile phones or radio with your television at that time,
Paul Stevenson, chairperson of the Royal British Legion, Republic of Ireland District.
So they were completely ostracised, and a lot of them lived out a meagre existence. Some of them got houses. I was in Killester yesterday where there were 300 houses built for families of the World War I people, and even my own little village road in County Offaly, there was one soldier's house built there, and he was lucky, that man, because he got a job as a local postman.
And keeping with the topic of housing for veterans, much of it was for those permanently wounded. Brian White.
Anybody who had an injury found it more difficult, and therefore the whole area was provide social housing for them. So with that, you had the Soldiers and Sailors Association who set up the Soldiers and Sailors homes. And again, in an awful lot of towns like Bray, you have these Soldiers and Sailors homes. They were based on class, so you had officers and the non-commissioned people had different styles of housing.
It's nowadays widely accepted by historians that tens of thousands of Irish World War I veterans suffered from physical injuries for the rest of their lives. Paul Stevenson of the Royal British Legion once again.
I mean, I remember they had wooden crutches, these guys, wooden. And some of them, I remember one man that lost his leg, and I think he made his own crutch. Cut a piece of timber and made a crutch for himself out of it. So, You know, as I said, I'm sure, I mean, the medical facilities 100 years ago weren't the same as they are now. And they were competing with locals as well. And but the Legion, there were a lot of ex-doctors who kind of looked after their fellows as well, you know.
And we'll hear more very shortly about the work done for veterans by the British Legion. But sticking for the moment with talk of wounded veterans, many of them endured long-term physical suffering from gas used in the war. Military historian James Durney.
Gas wounds is another big one as well, which we tend to not know much or forget about, because you had a lot of these other illnesses at the time, tuberculosis, consumption, which you can get from a gas wound then as well. So a lot of people die later on in years afterwards from TB or consumption, and it's a lot of it have come from being in close confinement in wet conditions in Europe and that.
Basically, for 4 years, you were in the same muddy hole, for want of a better description.
Historian John Goodman.
So those guys coming back to readjust to going from that military lifestyle back into civilian life was going to be difficult. If you were coming back already suffering from something, was even more so. When we got back to Ireland, then obviously the political situation here was very different. Nobody wanted to hear about it. But a thing that I think as well that we've downplayed with this is people weren't capable of talking about it.
Already in this programme it's been touched on that most World War I veterans were extremely reluctant to discuss their experiences with the general public or even with their families. So why was this the case? Historian Brian Kenny of the Irish Great War Society.
Your family couldn't actually envisage what that man had gone through. The only one who could actually understand is someone who was there with him, who had gone through it, who had seen the horrors of it. You couldn't tell your children, your wife. You just couldn't envisage. No verbal description could actually tell them what happened or what you felt.
God, my grandfather, he never talked about it. And that's all you'll hear. Or, yeah, he'd talk about it and he'd get very emotional and he'd stop. Or he used to go meet 2 other veterans of a Tuesday or a Wednesday and they'd have a few pints.
Irish Defence Forces Commandant retired Larry Scallon.
They remembered within themselves, but they never spoke publicly about their experiences of the Great War.
Why? Was it just too uncomfortable, or was it the Ireland, or was it a mix of everything, or what, Larry? What's your own opinion?
I'm going to say it's a mix of everything, because I can talk about, listen, my military service was calm and tame compared to what any of those men experienced. But I had incidents in my career in overseas service, and I would meet with guys who were there with me, and we can talk about it. But you don't talk about it to the general public because they say, what's he talking about? You cop on, do you know?
So how exactly did World War I veterans deal with their shell shock or PTSD? Brian Crawford of the Royal British Legion.
Basically, the only way to deal with it is to talk to other people who've been through it and know about it. It's no use talking to a total stranger because they haven't a clue about what you're feeling like, what you went through. The only way to deal with it is in the old Legion clubs where you met a lot of other guys who had similar experiences.
From the 1920s onwards, dozens of British Legion clubs and also old comrades associations were established in towns and parishes throughout the Irish Free State, or what is now our modern Irish Republic. Paul Stevenson.
Well, there was numerous Legion clubs around and old comrades clubs around the country, quite a lot actually. There was nearly one in every parish in the country, and they were a means for where these guys could go and meet like-minded people. They could go, I don't know, once a week or whatever it was, and they could sit down. Some of the places had a bar, they could have a pint and a chat and talk to like-minded people, which they probably couldn't do in an ordinary pub because they never knew who was going to sit beside them. And wives went in and they made tea and that sort of thing, and provided sandwiches, and it was somewhere to go. And remember, a lot of these fellas wouldn't have a whole lot of money either.
The main help after the war, a lot of it was financial, and the finance was usually dealt with by the women in the Legion. They seem to be the people, looking back at the records, that actually did a huge amount of fundraising and a huge amount of distribution of welfare.
Brian Crawford. Here's historian Kieran Gregor from Youghal in County Cork.
A couple of years back I produced a book on Youghal with old photographs, and one of them is one of the British Legion. When I look at the group, it's a substantial group of people, maybe 25, 30 people in a group, men and women, and they're quite publicly a big sign British Legion in front of them. And I then can see also, looking at old newspapers, British Legion card whist drives. They're raising money all the time, and there's a reason for it.
So what exactly was that reason?
They actually owned 4 houses in Youghal for the veterans who came back. And one man, for example, came back missing a leg, and people who had horrific experiences. And so the British Legion supported these.
Where the Scout then is in a tie up in St. John's, that was the British Legion Hall. And I'm assuming that the soldiers were meeting regularly there, and they're probably talking and having a few beers, whatever, cup of tea, coffee. It was probably their way of breaking down what happened to them and all that sort of thing. And there probably was the local doctor that was probably out there, because there was a number of doctors from the town that were out there, that was helping them and making sure that everyone was all right.
Historian Clement Roach from Athy in County Kildare. And because over 2/3 of Athy's male populace had served in the war, unlike many places, the town had certain pubs where veterans met to drink and talk.
They went down and they had their few pints there Sunday morning or after Mass or whatever the case would be. Part of the Sunday tradition, as it was back then. They went down, they had their few pints, the boys got around in the corner, they talked, and they were probably throwing out their war stories about whatever the case would be. And it's like, I have a friend who was in the Irish Army, served out in the Leb, and I asked him one day, I should get your stories. He says, you get them when I'm drunk. You know what I mean? So there you go. It was probably the same with the men that came back. And the women, of course, probably, because we do have a number of women that served as well in the First World War and various things.
And Clem, just brings me to the question, were there many Athy women involved in the First World War?
Yeah, there was. They were in munitions, and of course a few of them were nurses. But yeah, there was a few women. There was approximately 30 or 40 women that did serve.
A high proportion of the nurses who served in the 1914-18 war worked in high-risk environments where they encountered extreme physical mutilation and profound psychological trauma. Sabina Purcell.
3,000 to 4,000 nurses served in World War I from the island of Ireland. They didn't exactly have anaesthetic, so you weren't exactly asleep when you were getting treated. I'd say they faced the unimaginable.
The nurses, they're kind of the unsung heroes of the war.
Brian Kenny.
The soldiers would go, but they would be cleaning up the mess afterwards. As those soldiers lay dying in the tents, they would be writing last letters home for them. They'd be holding their hands as they passed away. They would see the full horrors of the war, the ghastly wounds they would have to clean. Just watching young men die in agony and pain, it must have been, you can't even imagine what these young nurses would have went through.
The annals of history record that many nurses and also ambulance people suffered PTSD after the war. Historian Rob Goodbody from County Wicklow, whose pacifist Quaker grandfather served in the war.
Now, my Quaker grandfather was a pacifist, followed his pacifist leanings, and joined a volunteer ambulance corps that was not affiliated to the army, but was there to do what it could to help with the suffering. And he ended up in the front line in France. In Dunkirk was a very heavy fighting around Dunkirk region. And we don't know much about what happened with him because he never spoke about it. But what we do know is that he was brought back to Ireland as a medical case, not injured, but basically what we today would call PTSD, then they would have called shell shock or whatever. So he had some kind of a breakdown. I mean, think about it, that being there in the war is a very simplistic case. You're at the back end of a rifle and whoever you're shooting at is out of sight and whatever. It's not like that in reality. And the ambulance people, the stretcher bearers, are the ones who are out there picking up the mess afterwards. It must have been pretty atrocious.
You'd never be the same again.
You'd never recover from it, what you'd seen there. A whole new aspect on life. A deep mental hurt there as a result of what he'd seen and experienced.
Every year the National War Memorial Gardens at Island Bridge in Dublin play host to various commemoration services to remember those Irish people who served in various wars. Now recently I attended one such service.
My name is James Kavanagh and this is my brother
Michael Kavanagh.
We're here today to remember our grandfather Michael Conway, who joined in 1915 and served through the whole war and survived. He suffered after it from nightmares, which my mother vividly remembers. She could not make out anything of what he was saying bar Hill 60. And that is a small hill outside Ypres in Belgium, which was fought over continually during the whole war. He would not talk to his family about it, so they knew nothing else. But every November the 11th, he would parade down here. They lived not too far in a place called the Ranch. They would come down to these gardens with his pals.
The Memorial Gardens here in Island Bridge.
And for this ceremony. And then have a good talk with his buddies about it.
I'd say that was important.
It was their only release. My wife's great uncle is buried in Ypres, and my mother's dad, Michael Conway, fought on Hill 60, which is also in Ypres. So we decided to bring them out on a trip. My mother-in-law had never seen her great uncle's grave, and we wanted to show my mother Hill 60. And she had a good time on the trip, but the only time she really got upset and refused to leave the car was when we came to Hill 60. She wouldn't come out and even look at it with us.
Why?
I'd say all the memories of her dad, like the trauma of her dad having the nightmares, so obviously it affected her really badly. Yeah.
She would have had to experience the trauma of the granddad over quite a period of time, you know, because they were living in a very small little house.
Here in Dublin?
Yeah.
As was mentioned several times already in this documentary, in the decades following the war, countless veterans were unable to integrate back into their communities. County Wicklow military historian John Goodman.
When you talk to older people, and they talked about people who were never right when they came home, you know, growing up here, and they'd see the guy going down the road with his medals and things like that, and he was never right. You know, you could tease them and the war, he was never right after the war. It was very common in Irish society.
I remember Mickey Cummins of Skin and Gun, who served in the First World War and came back with shell shock.
Michael Dempsey of Castledermot Local History Group in County Kildare.
And we as children would have thought he was odd, because You know, he'd never look in our direction, never recognise us, wouldn't bid the time of day to many of the locals, and it was obvious there was something wrong. And Jack the basketman the same. We as kids used to go down and have a look in at him, and he tried to ignore us.
After the war, Jack Fitzgerald, or Jack the basketman as he was better known, settled down in Castledermot, County Kildare, and lived in a trench there. Castledermot historian Gerard Whelan.
The likes of Jack the Basket probably survived the whole war intact and came home and then couldn't deal with it, and then decides that he's only safe in a hole in the ground. If that's not PTSD, I don't know what PTSD is.
There's an old saying in the world of shell shock or PTSD that an abnormal reaction to an abnormal situation is totally normal. For this reason, many veterans who survived the abnormal horrors of World War I ended up in mental asylums. Now here's Gerard Whelan once again talking about war veteran Patrick Byrne from Barnhill in Castledermot, County Kildare, who ended up in St Dimphna's Mental Institution in Carlow.
Patrick Byrne was discharged from the army in 1916 and spent his whole life in the asylum in Carlow Town. And now, in fairness to the British Army, they looked after him very well, but he came back to Barnhill, and within a month or two he was shipped off to hospital and spent the rest of his life there. My sister, who's a psychiatric nurse, actually remembers looking after him in the hospital many years.
St Dimphna's Hospital in Carlow.
Yeah,
wow.
Yeah.
I mean, and that was directly related to the war.
Yep, absolutely.
It's generally acknowledged by experts that one of the highest rates of suicide globally is among veterans of serious conflict. Mary Ann Marr of the 18th Regiment of Foot Royal Irish Regiment and South Irish Horse Association.
PTSD definitely was a big factor. Most men probably didn't die from it. A lot of suicides probably from it. We have some stories of men with horrendous suicides of, drowning themselves. We've one man that shot himself in the mouth, a man from One Star from Wexford.
You will see many drownings. You'll see guys committed suicide, lots of them after the war, and we haven't really studied that,
Larry Scallon. Here's Michael Kavanagh.
It's very hard to get accurate figures on what the level of suicide was, but it must have been pretty high, given the fact that so many of them had come back in such a very, very delicate mental state. It wouldn't take very much for them to flip, if that would be the right term. But the authorities, they tended to suppress to a degree the actual suicide counts overall. But I would reckon there was a significant number of ex-soldiers who did commit suicide because of their war experiences.
However, for the vast majority of World War I veterans, life went on after the war, even though some just never settled down. Sharon Green of Castledermot Local History Group.
Talking to other people I know, local historians and so on, who'd be a bit older than me, them still remembering people in the Kildare area, in towns like Athy, and having encountered people in their lives who, by then were quite elderly, but they'd come back and they'd never managed to fit back into regular life. They may have been living on the streets or, just about getting by in life.
Wandering the roads, Knights of the Road.
Exactly, Knights of the Road, that's it. And some of them lived to be quite old, so they found a way of living, but it's still quite sad. And, very often people were aware that they had, they were a bit different or they might have had problems. A lot of people looked after them. They'd call to houses and people would give them a bite to eat or a cup of tea.
There's another great example of a guy called, he was known locally in South Kildare as the Knight of the Road.
Gerard Whelan, talking about World War I veteran Harry Tully.
My father would have spoke about him, and he had a great reputation. He was actually from Sligo originally. Again, fought in the war, fought in the Irish Civil War. I would say he was, after his demobilisation into Curra, say after the end of the Civil War, didn't go anywhere. All he did was he tramped the roads of South Kildare, a little bit of Carlow, a little bit of Wicklow, following the markets and the sunshine, as he said himself, right? And he didn't live anywhere. He lived in people's sheds. So he could rock up here, he'd knock on the door, you'd say, Harry, great to see you, here's the shed, here's some food, blah, blah, blah. There's stories I know of people saying that they woke up in the morning as kids and Harry would be sitting by the fire. And the parents would go off to work and leave Harry by the fire. Because even though he was a tramp, he was a gentleman tramp. And that's why he was called the Knight of the Road. But he was well received everywhere he went. But he chose, again, that's the way he wanted to live his life after fighting 2 wars, was to go live and just follow the sunshine, as he said himself.
And here's what Dominic Preachy of the Irish Great War Society had to say about World War I veteran Jim Fitzgerald, better known as Lacandara Jim, who lived in a mountain cave in County Waterford.
He lived in the Waterford Mountains in the Cummers in a cave after the First World War, and locals used to feed him and bring him up food. But whenever there was a thunderstorm, the local parish priest used to go up and look after him, because he relived being in France because of the noise of the thunder and so on. It reminded him, it brought him right back.
There's this story is about a person called John the Box.
Bray local historian Brian White.
He had a small little wooden box with wheels on it, and he would have it pulled along by a donkey, and he would be up at the back gates of the Dargle and playing fiddle music for people going in to see the Lover's Leap in the Dargle. And in there, they would hope to throw a few bob into his box that he was in. But he was known as nothing else as John the Box. We don't know whether his name was John or any other name. He just went by the name of John the Box.
But you were telling me, you do know that everyone knew he was a Great War veteran. He had maybe issues, you were telling me earlier on, and this is how he kind of earned a few coppers for the next drink.
The next drink, wherever. And we don't know where he lived, because it was totally, there's only pictures of John the Box on the National Gallery of Ireland's digital photograph collection, and it's John the Box and it's scary, and nobody knows where he comes from, what he is, or whether his name is John or Box or anything else, and that's it. A First World War victim.
One of the most common toxic legacy consequences of shell shock or post-traumatic stress disorder among World War I veterans was alcoholism. Galway historian William Henry.
Nobody really knew what post-traumatic stress was at the time, but there was lots of people that did suffer from it. And in many cases, I remember another lady telling me that her father went to war, a wonderful man, and he came back an absolute tyrant, in the sense that he was never in good form. But the man was suffering. And he became an alcoholic, and I found that with a number of not them all, of course, but some of them. And I remember a man telling me a story once that it was down near Bernard, that side. Here there was an old railway bridge there, and there was a man went off to war, and he came back after 4 years of warfare, and he never lived in a house again. He slept all the time under the railway bridge. It was an old railway, disused railway bridge. There was a little bit of a shelter in there, and that's where he spent the rest of his life. Now, that had to be post-traumatic stress, but nobody knew what it was at the time, God help him. And there's lots of incidences around like that of people that went away with one personality and came back with another. And there's one man that I know, he came back and he lived out his life in his own home. But they said that he never spent a day, but that he wasn't drinking after it. But that's not them all now again. But I'm just saying the tragedy of it, the tragedy of the people that did suffer from the post-traumatic stress.
many Irish people who survived World War I fought in the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, better known as the Anzacs. Now, after the war, many of them, suffering chronic PTSD, lost contact with their families back in Ireland. County Kildare historian Jackie Green, whose uncle fought in the war.
It was also noted that base records in Melbourne, where all the connection to the families and all the letters and all the post and everything went, and there were numerous letters from families looking for their missing Anzac men. But the men had made no contact with them and couldn't face them. And they couldn't be found. They just vanished off to the outback or cattle stations or wherever and were never found again. Either that or the mines. And too many of them then were found in the hospitals and mental homes, while others just drank to dull the memories. So very sad for a lot of people. My uncle was fine, and a lot of them were fine and settled into civvy life. But a lot of them had serious struggles.
The music you're currently listening to is O'Carolan's Farewell and was arranged by T.C. Kelly and performed by the Irish Chamber Orchestra. Over the course of this radio documentary, we've investigated just a few of the countless stories of those Irish people who served in and survived the 1914-18 war. What's clear from our investigation is that they returned home to a radically changed Ireland, where their efforts and sacrifice in the war were largely ignored and rarely, if ever, acknowledged in public. While the majority of World War I veterans successfully reintegrated back into civilian life, a significant number didn't, and ended up as alcoholics or locked up in mental institutions or wandering the country as so-called Knights of the Road. Now, although for most of the 20th century the stories of those Irish people who served in World War I were lost in the mists of time, so to speak, thankfully nowadays there are various community-focused endeavours throughout our modern Irish Republic to remember them at last. Larry Scallon.
A lot of local initiatives to build memorials or get memorials built at a county basis. I see there's one in Clare now, there's one in Wicklow, there's one in Kilkenny, there's different types in lots of other counties. So counties are now, and county councils are understanding the need to remember and commemorate these life stories.
These were Irish people who went to the war. Thousands of them died, but many of them survived and came back. Some injured, some healthy, some with shell shock.
If we don't remember them, who is going to remember them?
Funded by Commemoration with the television licence fee.